morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kelly Weiner, and I'm the managing attorney at Scott Legal. We are going to spend some time today talking about E-2 visa options, particularly cases where the investment amount is low or kind of other types of risky E-2 cases. So a few things before we get started. Some of you may know that this law firm, Scott Legal, was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the U.S. personally on an E-2 visa. The firm is also a full-service immigration firm, but we focus primarily on E-2 visas. We've processed hundreds of them, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk. So that includes kind of lower investment amounts. We've processed at consulates around the world, but our primary consulates are Toronto and London. We will continue our webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a month on different topics. And at the end of this webinar, we'll send a few things. So one is a PowerPoint that you'll see here today. Another is an E-2 visa guide. And another is a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars. In terms of our panelists today, my name is Kelly LeGrand Weiner, and I'm the managing attorney at Scott Legal, and I will be doing the first part of the presentation. We're also very lucky to have Michaela Vrazdova, who's a senior associate at Scott Legal and has vast experience processing E-2 visas. If you have questions, please send them through the chat box. We will try to get to them either as we, as we go, if it's relevant to what we're talking about, or it will also reserve some time at the end for questions. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand. I see that somebody asked about whether or not we're on mute, so we have checked that that may be an issue on your end. We've checked on our side that the volume seems to be coming through. So please feel free to kind of leave or re-enter to see if that will assist. So without further ado, I'm going to get started by talking about the E-2 visa requirements. So the E-2 visa is a treaty country visa. This means that you must be a national of a treaty country to qualify for this visa. And what this means is this is based on where you have a passport. So it's not based kind of on your country of birth, but where you actually, so perhaps we have many clients that may have been born in India, and perhaps they've moved to Canada, and now they have a passport, they're a Canadian citizen and have a passport for Canada. So these people would count and would be able to get the E-2 visa. This is different than some other parts of immigration law where it's not as relevant where you have a passport, but where you were born. But luckily for the E-2 visa, it's where you have a passport. So the other requirement is that if you're going to be an E-2 investor, you have to own at least 50% in the E-2 company. You also must make an investment, and the investment must be substantial. So we'll talk a little bit more about what counts as substantial, later in the presentation. In order to qualify, your funds must be at risk and irrevocably committed. So what this means is you can't just take a lump sum of money and put it in a bank account and say that that's your investment. Your investment actually has to be committed. So that means that it has to be spent on various things. If you're doing a startup, you want to spend everything necessary to get the business up and running. If you're purchasing a business, then generally the fair market value of that business on the open market is going to be considered substantial, but it should make sense in light of the financials of that business. As part of the investment requirement, you have to prove that your investment funds come from a legitimate source. So this can be from personal savings, from a gift, from a sale of personal property. It can also be from a loan, but the loan cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 business. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind with a loan. This also precludes kind of seller financing. So if you're purchasing a business and there's seller financing, often that seller financing means that the security is the actual E-2 business. So the security for that loan is the E-2 business. So this is why seller financing often will not work in the E-2 context. So when we look at typical E-2 expenditures, these really should be anything that's necessary to get your type of business up and running. So it's going to depend on the type of business you're starting, but some expenditures we commonly see are things like inventory, equipment. For example, if almost every business needs computers of some kind, perhaps a website, if you need office supplies, office rent, commercial office space, if you need storage space. Businesses should generally spend on marketing, business entity setup, insurance, things like that. So when you're starting a business, the focus of your investment is going to be on money you spend to get that business to the point of being operational. So to give an example, we had a client who was starting up a gym, and when she attended her interview, the officer asked, okay, if I was to go to your gym, what would I see? And she had rented the space. She had purchased all of the gym equipment. The gym equipment was there. She had gotten all the insurance that she needed. And she basically said, yes, everything in the gym is ready. All that's needed is for me to come and turn the lights on and, open the doors so people can start, coming to the gym. So those are the types of expenditures you need to be making to get yourself to the point of being operational. When you're purchasing a business, you have kind of two options. So one is you can purchase the business outright. This is where you're going to transfer your funds to the seller. And then, you submit your application and you start running the business once you get approved for the E-2 visa. Another option when you're purchasing a business is an escrow arrangement. And the benefit of an escrow arrangement is it helps protect you a little bit more in the event the visa is not granted. So if you're pursuing an escrow arrangement, what this means is when you make the purchase, instead of transferring the money directly to the seller, you transfer the money to an escrow agent. And in this situation, every condition that was listed in the purchase sale agreement must be satisfied already, except for the grant of the E-2 visa. So all other conditions and contingencies in the purchase sale agreement have to already have been satisfied. And if that is the case, and the only condition left is the approval of the E-2 visa, then this will work, for an E-2 visa application. And the officers will consider the funds to still be at risk, even though they are in an escrow account. And the escrow instructions would say that if the E-2 visa is granted, the money will go to the seller. And if the E-2 visa is denied, the money will revert to the buyer. So this is an arrangement that can sometimes protect your investment a little bit more. So another requirement for the E-2 visa is your business cannot be marginal. So it has to be able to make an economic impact. And generally what this means is you need to show you're going to hire US employees because the business needs to support more than just the investor and their family. This is something where it's not required that you hire employees prior to applying for the E-2 visa if you have a startup, but what you need to submit is a 5-year business plan that outlines, a viable, financial plan and personnel plan over the coming 5 years to show that you plan to hire US workers over that period of time. And we generally recommend, showing that you're able to hire at least 3 to 4 full-time workers by year 5 of operation. This isn't, a strict requirement anywhere, but we think that generally that is, favorable for getting an E-2 visa approved for a startup. Another requirement is the business has to be real and operating. So we talked about this a little bit earlier with the gym, where you need to have gotten the business to the point where it's ready to start operating relatively soon after you enter the US on your E-2 visa. Let's say that you're renovating a restaurant. You would want to have a reasonable timeline for when that renovation is going to be complete after you get your E-2 visa. So you wouldn't want to attend your interview and say, well, yes, I'm renovating this restaurant and it'll be ready to operate, a year and a half from now. You'd want to have it much, much closer to being ready to be real and operational, at the time you attend your E-2 visa interview. So if the business is already running, you're buying a business that's already operational, then you would want to show things like tax returns, W-2s, payroll summary, invoices to show that the business is running. And if it's a startup, you would want to show things like a signed commercial lease, you've set up your business entity, your company website is created, you have contracts, you've obtained all necessary licenses and things like that. Another requirement for the E-2 visa is you show that you are coming to develop and direct the enterprise. So the E-2 visa is not for, somebody who wants to kind of retire in the United States and just be a passive owner. To be to be qualified for the E-2 visa, you need to show that you yourself are planning to come to the US to develop and direct the business, and to kind of do those high level, activities in terms of creating business objectives and business strategies, hiring and training and managing the staff and things like that. So the last requirement we'll talk about is you do have to have the intent to return to your home country upon the expiration of the E-2 visa. So that means the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that does not have dual intent. So that being said, there is a relatively easy standard to meet for the E-2 visa in this regard. Generally, most clients can just sign a letter confirming that they intend to depart from the United States. And this usually will, be satisfactory to prove that you have non-immigrant intent. Signing that letter also doesn't prevent you from renewing the visa or from eventually applying for a green card, if you ultimately want to do that. But it is an important part of an application, to demonstrate that at this particular time, at this particular entry, you do not have immigrant intent. We can go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about, how long the visa lasts. So we mentioned that the treaty investor visa, is only available to nationals of certain countries. So you do have to have that treaty country nationality. We've talked a little bit about the options. So you can either purchase an existing business or you can start up a new business in the US. And there are treaty countries really, all over the world. There are countries from Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, Europe. So there's a publicly available list from the Department of State. So you can always look that up if you have questions. And the countries do change over time. So for example, Israel, over the past several years became an E-2 visa treaty country. Whereas there's other countries like Bolivia where, they used to be, but are no longer. So always important to, keep in mind, is your country still a treaty country? And you can check that on the Department of State website. And then the other question that comes up is, how long will your E-2 visa be valid for? And this is based on something called a reciprocity schedule. So the United States will offer kind of a certain amount of time on this type of visa dependent on what the other country offers to US citizens for a similar type of visa. So for many countries, they can get the E-2 visa up to 5 years. So for example, in, citizens of the UK, citizens of Canada, you can get the E-2 visa for 5 years. And then there's other countries where there's a lesser period of time. So for example, Australia is 4 years. And this does change over time. So always important to, to look at this. And then there are some countries, for example, Egypt and Bangladesh, where you can only get the visa for 3 months. So even though you only have the visa for 3 months, the visa is just an entry document. So you use that visa to enter the United States. And then each time you enter, you're eligible to be given 2 years on E-2 status. So that's also true for people who have 5-year visas. If you have a 5-year visa, when you enter the US, you won't be given an I-94 for 5 years. You'll be given an I-94 for 2 years. And then you would need to leave and re-enter the country. But you could do so with that, 5-year valid visa. Whereas somebody who has a visa that's only valid for 3 months would be able to enter the US, could potentially stay for 2 years, but then every time they traveled internationally, they would need to go and get a new visa to allow them to enter the US in E-2 status. Perfect. So let's talk about investment. I think this is just, one of the most common questions we get, which is how much investment is enough? So you must invest a substantial amount of money. And there is nothing in the regulations that says what a substantial amount of money is. So there's no particular dollar, figure that we can look at to tell us, this is what counts as substantial. What is substantial is going to depend on something called the proportionality test. So this is, how much money you've invested versus what are the actual costs to establish this type of business. So you really need to look to the type of business. There may be, businesses that require very low startup costs, like we'll talk about these a bit later. Consulting companies, service-based companies, often need, have very, very low startup costs. And then there's companies like, for example, a car manufacturer or a restaurant where you're going to have some very large fixed costs to set up that type of business. So Generally, if you're looking at a business that's kind of on the lower side of the investment amount, so things that are under, $250,000 and lower, you want to show you've invested 100% of the cost, to set up that business. So generally, you want to, for example, if your investment amount is going to be somewhere around $100,000, you really want to show that you've spent everything necessary to get that business up and running. You may also want to include articles, market industry reports that help establish what are normal startup costs for this type of business to show you've invested 100%. When the investments get very, very large, so an example that's provided in the regulations is perhaps an investment of $100 million is needed, perhaps for something like commercial real estate development, and you've invested $10 million. In a case like that, the size of the investment being so large, likely that would still qualify as substantial, even though based on the proportionality test, it's a low, percentage of the total investment amount. However, especially I'd say for most of the cases that we work with and, the focus that we have today on low investment amounts, you really want to be aiming to spend 100% of what's necessary to set up the business. Definitely something to keep in mind. When you're doing a purchase of a business, then the proportionality test will, generally the purchase price is going to be considered the fair market value of the business, and that will be considered substantial. Michaela will talk about this a little more in the future, but, like if you're purchasing the business from a related party or a family member, then it can be a little bit trickier. Maybe you want to get a valuation, but if the seller is somebody you don't know, you have no relationship to them, and this is the amount that they're offering on the open market, generally that amount is going to be considered substantial. But it should make sense in light of the financials of the company, because they will want to see that. So the tax returns of the company, if they're showing very, very high assets, very, very high income, and you've purchased the business for a very, very low amount, that's something that they could certainly question. All right, so let's talk a little bit about strategies to deal with a low dollar amount. So you want to think about what is the overall strength of the E-2 application. If you have a low investment amount and it's not possible to raise that investment amount, either because, you don't have the funds or you don't want to spend the money in that way and take that risk. The other things you can do are try to have every other piece of the application be as strong as possible. So for example, you want to have a strong real and operating and marginality section. So, proof of contracts with clients who want to hire you, letters of intent if you can't get contracts. You can also reach out to local business organizations, such as the local Chamber of Commerce or other kind of market or trade organizations in your area, perhaps get letters of support, particularly the Chamber of Commerce. Sometimes will write a letter indicating that your type of business will bring jobs to the area. That's always very positive for the E-2 visa application. On the marginality side, you want to have a very strong 5-year business plan that outlines a good financial plan showing that you'll have, increasing revenues and good profits. You also want to show that the company will be able to hire, U.S. employees. If you're able to hire a U.S. employee before filing, that can also really help a lot. And let's look at some examples just to, get more specific. So in example 1, you're opening a business with a low investment amount, but you have 2 employees, the business is taking in revenue, and you have 10 clients. So in this case, it's very clear that the business is not marginal. It has U.S. workers already. It is making a good economic impact with its revenues. It has the ability to have clients. The company's already operating. So in that case, even with a lower investment amount, you could probably make a relatively strong argument, that the business, that this was substantial and everything the business needed to start operating. When we look at the second example, you have a low investment amount, you have no employees. In this case, there's nothing that indicates there's any contracts or anything like that. So that's kind of going to be a weaker case. So the key takeaway here is really just that if you have a low investment amount and you're not able to bring that amount up for whatever reason, you really need to be looking at all of the other categories to see how strong you can make those categories, to help give your case the best chance of approval. All right, so let us talk about some common E-2 visa expenditures. So, again, the expenditures should be based on the type of business you're starting. So, each business may be a bit different in that regard. However, these are some common ones that are often used and are, familiar to the consulate, and also things that, most businesses, for example, at this point should have a website. So, very common to pay for kind of website setup and hosting, computers, printers, scanners. If you have inventory in your line of business, you can prepay for some inventory to have that available to you. Furniture, again, though, only if it's used for business purposes. If you're buying something, like let's say, you're like you say, well, I'm going to work from my home, so I'm getting a dining table set and I'm going to sit and work at my dining table. That's not going to be a good E-2 expense. They generally will discount anything that's going to be used, for your residence or for personal uses along with business uses. So you really need, if you're going to include furniture, it should be very specific that it's for your office. So, if you have trademark or intellectual property, anything that you pay to employees, anything you pay to independent contractors, legal fees can also be included, commercial lease, agreement, anything you pay for a commercial space can be used. As I discussed before, even if you're using your home as the place where you're going to work, mortgage payments or lease payments for a residence are not going to be, included for an E-2 visa application. You can also include office supplies. Training courses sometimes can be used. I'd say this is generally a weaker expense, but if there's something very specific or relevant, you're starting some type of niche marketing consultancy, and perhaps you've taken, a recent marketing training or certification in that area, that may be able to be included. But for example, someone is starting a law firm, the costs that they paid for their law degree or for the bar exam, those would not be included as part of the, E-2 expenses. You can also include things like licensing fees. If you're attending relevant trade shows, the cost of entry could be included, but not cost for travel or lodging. If you're purchasing property, again, the property, though, it wouldn't be residential. It would need to be property you're developing for your business. And you would also just want to watch out, because if you got a mortgage, a big chunk of that could actually not be utilized as part of your E-2 investment, since it would be secured by the, by the assets of the E-2 business. You can also potentially pay for a car or a truck. However, as indicated here, it needs to be used exclusively for the business. For example, a taxi, food truck. So if you're just buying, if you say, well, I'm a consultant, I need to visit my clients, just buying a car for that is generally not going to work. Whereas perhaps, let's say that you are running some type of janitorial or cleaning franchise, and you need to have a truck to bring, to carry around all of your cleaning supplies, that's the type of thing that would work generally for an E-2 visa. Also, software services that you pay for can be included, any type of advertising. And so now let's talk a little bit about kind of good expenditures versus weak expenditures. Go to the next slide. So, we just talked about a bunch of good expenditures. So some bad or weak expenditures are things on this list. For example, travel, travel accommodations, hotels, meals, any taxis, any entertainment. Additionally, if you're paying something, but it's being, immediately reimbursed by a client, like if they've already reimbursed you or they're really paying for it, that is not going to, be a good expense. Similarly, like let's say that you purchase a car from, your brother or a parent, that's going to be a weaker expense than if you purchased it from an unrelated third party. So not to say that it can't be included, but if an officer, learns that you purchased it from a related party, or that comes out during the interview, it can weaken the case. And for these other types of expenses, one of the reasons we don't recommend including them is that even if it bolsters the investment amount, as the officer starts to look at the specifics, they then, will start to discount things and take things off. And so it can lead to kind of a more negative review of the case if they feel like you're padding the investment amount with expenditures that are not considered good expenditures. And some consults even have on their website, do not include flights, do not include travel expenses. So they're just quite clear that they don't view these as kind of valid startup expenses, for the E-2 visa. I think at this point, we will talk about some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses, and Michaela will help us talk about those.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about, consulting businesses and getting E-2 visas for consulting businesses. Theoretically, very low investment amount may be sufficient to start a consulting business. So, you can, for example, you can work from your home. You can just purchase your like a laptop, set up a website, and that may be the kind of like the only things you need to purchase to get the company up and running. So theoretically, you can spend around $5,000 and get the business kind of up and running. But this will not be sufficient investment to get an E-2 visa. So as we discussed, in the beginning, for the E-2 visa, you have to make that substantial investment in the E-2 company, and what the government wants to see is that you are committed to successfully operating the business, and you put the investment money at risk, and basically, you have something to lose, if the business is not successful. They will want to see that kind of like larger initial investment for the E-2 visa. So we generally kind of like recommend to make any expenditures you wouldn't necessarily want to make, in the beginning, but you would make, in the next several months or in the year or 1 or 2 of operations. So if you are thinking about some expenditures you want to make eventually, but you wouldn't want to make them initially, for the E-2 visa, we do recommend that you kind of like make them initially, so we can include them as part of the investment amount. So some things you may think about, and some things you may spend money on are, for example, office space. As I said, some people, you may be able to run the company from your home, but it definitely kind of strengthens the E-2 application if you have a commercial office space, because the officer sees that, you are kind of serious about starting this business. And also any kind of like grant you prepay can be included as part of the investment amount. So like, let's say that you prepay 6 months or 12 months of commercial office space for your company, that can be included as part of your investment. Then, like any equipment, computer equipment, scanners, printers, or anything like that you purchase for yourself and for your, future employees, that can be included as part of the investment. Any money you invest in marketing, that can be included. And also, if you hire employees, any money you pay them up until the point the E-2 petition is submitted, that can be included as part of the investment. And also, as Kelly mentioned, even in this case, even if the investment amount would be kind of like on the lower side, but you are already paying, let's say, even one part-time employee, like that would strengthen the application. So now let's talk about some common challenges for real estate investment and kind of like businesses in the real estate industry. So, generally, so what will not work for the E-2 visa is that, if you buy like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 properties in the US, you just kind of like put them under your LLC and just kind of like passively collect rent from people. So that will not work for the E-2 visa, because as we discussed, one of the requirements for the E-2 visa is that the company is kind of like an active enterprise, is a real and operating business. So just kind of passively collecting rent and kind of like not providing any type of services to the people. So that will not work for the E-2 visa. What will work for the E-2 visa is, for example, real estate brokerage firms. So we have done E-2 visas for real estate brokerage companies. real estate management company. So, if you have kind of like large portfolio, if the E2 company has a large portfolio of properties, it will manage, that would work for the E2 visa. The properties can be either, owned only by the E2 company, but we generally recommend that the E2 company also manages other properties, of kind of like other owners. And the property management company should be done on a larger scale. So the company shouldn't manage like 5 houses or like apartment units, but it should be on kind of like much larger scale, like 50 units or something like that. Also, we have done E2 visas for real estate renovation and construction companies. That would work for an E2 visa. And also house flipping, if your company wants to, buy houses, flip them and then sell them, that may work for an E2 visa. But again, it would have to be done on kind of like very large scale. So if you want, if the company would purchase, let's say like 1 to 2 houses per year, improve them and then sell them, like that would not work. The scale would have to be, around like 100, 100 houses per year or 100 projects per year, or larger, to again show, that the company is kind of active. So now let's discuss E2 visa for equity trading companies. Generally what will not work for an E2 visa is if you place your stock portfolio into the name of an LLC, and you will just kind of like manage that portfolio. That's not going to work. What the government wants to see is that you have, or the company has kind of like clients like other than yourself. And generally we recommend that the clients are not just your family members, but also like other unrelated third parties. And again, like you should have enough clients to show that there is kind of like enough activity of the company to show that the E2 company is an active business. And for this is a general comment for both kind of like the equity trading companies and the real estate company, is that these kind of industries are highly regulated, and generally, the company, the E2 company, has to obtain some sort of license before, to kind of like be able to provide the services. And each state in the US has kind of like different requirements, but this is something you should definitely kind of like look into to kind of see, like what type of licenses you will need, like how long is it going to take, to get these licenses and get the licenses before you start servicing clients. So now let's discuss some common reasons for E2 denials. So I would say the first common reason is that, the investment amount is just too low. So like, let's say that you invest, like $5,000 to $10,000 and then place $90,000 onto the E2 company's bank account. That will just not work for the E2 visa, because as we discussed, the government wants to see that you have made the substantial investment. You have already spent the money before they grant you the E2 visa. So the first reason would be that the investment amount is just too low. Another reason may be just the nature of the business. So like, let's say, as we discussed, for example, the kind of like the companies in the real estate industry, like, let's say that you own like 5 houses around the US, and you put them under the name of LLC, and the company is just kind of collecting rent, but is not really kind of like actively providing any services to the tenants. In that case, the application would be denied, just because the business wouldn't meet the requirements, and because it's not an active business. Another reason may be just the filing location or filing venue. So, some consulates are, just kind of like used to seeing like really high investment amounts. So, for example, the US consulate in Japan, in Tokyo, like they process a lot of E-2 visas, and they are kind of like used to seeing really high investment amounts. So like, let's say that you are starting a consulting business and you spend around 50,000 and you put additional like 40,000 on the company's bank account as working capital. I would say that applying at that consulate would be extremely risky, just because that consulate is used to seeing like very high investment amounts. So that may be, another thing to keep in mind is where can you apply for the E-2 visa? Like, do you want to apply at a consulate? Which consulate? And then, or is it better to apply with the USCIS? Then another thing may be, let's say that you are starting a consulting company in the US, and in the business plan, you are saying that you will hire 5 employees by year 5. But at the same time, you have been running a consulting company in your home country for, the past like 5 to 10 years, but you never hired any employees. So like you have done like all the consulting work, like you have done yourself. Like you have never hired an employee, like not even a secretary, like at that point, like the consulate may just kind of like, ask you about the business in your home country. They may ask you if you have had employees, and if you say no, they may kind of question like whether you will be able to hire the employees in the US, or the company will be able to hire the employees in the US. If you have never hired employees in your home country, and you would just have to kind of make an argument and explain, like why this business will be, will hire employees. So then another reason for denial may be that the officer is just kind of concerned whether the E-2 company will be able to hire US employees. So, let's say that the revenue numbers are on the kind of like on the lower side in the business plan. The officer just kind of like maybe concerned, or there is something else in the application. The officer just kind of like maybe concerned, whether you will be able to hire the employees as you are saying you will. Another reason for denial may be that there is just some like issue with the adjudicating officer. So, let's say that you have had a previous visa denial, and, there is just something in the database of the consulate, that they may see from like the previous interviews, like, like that may be a reason for denial. Or, the E-2 visa adjudication, it's just kind of very subjective process. So, sometimes the officers just kind of deny the visa, and it's not really kind of clear, what the reason for the denial was. And the kind of like the last common reason for denial is that you just didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So like, let's say that, someone submits an application and the investment amount, like they just kind of put $100,000 in the company's bank account, but like didn't spend any money, like then, that applicant would just not meet the requirements. Or like, let's say that someone is trying to apply from a country and is a national from country that is not a treaty country, that again, like that person would just not meet the basic E-2 visa requirements. So the visa, the visa application would be denied. Perfect. So let's discuss some E-2 visa adjudication trends and hot topics. So, one question we often get is, like what are kind of like what is the timeline to get an E-2 visa, like out of the consulates kind of back to the processing times like pre-COVID, or is it still kind of slower? So I will say like it usually depends on the consulate where you are applying. Some consulates are almost back to the kind of like the timelines they had prior to COVID, but some consulates are still kind of a little bit backlogged from kind of like the COVID area. So it will just depend where you're applying. But you know, for example, the US consulate in Toronto, they're almost back to the kind of like the timeline they had pre-COVID. So currently they're it takes around, you know, from the kind of like moment you submit, you should be able to schedule an interview within like 2 months. You know, then, for example, the US consulate in London is kind of still a little bit, you know, slower than it used to be before COVID, but it's, you know, it's not like you would be waiting for an interview for a year. But it is you know, kind of slower than it used to be. So I would say like it just kind of like generally depends like where you are applying, but the timelines are not as bad as they were in like 2020, 2021. So you know, one other thing you know, I wanted to discuss is kind of applying for an E-2 visa at a consulate versus extending your status in the United States. So, you know, let's say that you kind of, you know, like want to start your business in the US like as soon as possible. And the timeline for the interview in your home country is like, you know, like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 months. So then, you know, then you may benefit from kind of changing the status in the United States. So with the USCIS. So to qualify to change status in the United States, you would have to be in the US on a valid status. You know, so for example, if you are in the US as a business visitor on a B1 visa, or if you are here as a student, like F1, or, you know, on another status, like for example, L1, H1B, on any status, just not ESTA, because you are not able to change status from ESTA. You may file a change of status petition with the USCIS. So the benefit of this is that, you know, you can pay for a premium processing, and they will, if you pay additional fee for premium processing, they will adjudicate your petition within 15 calendar days. And if you get the approval, you can kind of, you know, the company can start operations once you get the approval. So the advantage of, you know, applying with USCIS is that you can get a decision fairly quickly. Now, you know, another advantage is that USCIS is used to kind of seeing lower investment amounts. So we have had cases where, you know, the investment amount was around, the amount spent was around like $40,000, then additional money on working capital. And these cases were approved with the USCIS, and they may have not been approved at a consulate. So that's another kind of advantage. Now, the kind of like the disadvantage, or the thing to keep in mind is when applying with the USCIS, is that they want to see kind of like extremely detailed documentation as to where the money you are investing is coming from. So, you know, this requirement at consulates is usually pretty relaxed, but USCIS wants to see kind of like the exact documents, like how you got the money, like how the money was transferred to you. So you will need a lot of documents to kind of be able to kind of like meet this requirement. So if you do want to apply with the USCIS, you know, we definitely recommend kind of like consulting with an attorney to kind of make sure that you have all the documents needed, you know, for this. And then another thing to keep in mind is that if you apply with the USCIS, you will get an approval for 2 years, which will allow you to stay in the US and, you know, like work for the E-2 company. But if you leave the United States, you will need to apply for a visa at a consulate. So if you are someone who kind of like needs to travel internationally frequently, you know, the change of status option may just not be the best, you know, the best for you. And then, you know, like if you are applying at a consulate and the visa is approved, then you would, as Kelly mentioned, then you would be granted an E-2 visa in your passport, and that visa, you know, with the visa, you would be able to travel internationally as long as the E-2 visa is valid. So now let's discuss some issues and some complex areas that come up with the E-2 visas. So, do you have to hire employees before you apply for an E-2 visa? So the answer is no. This is not a requirement. You don't have to have employees at the time you are applying for the visa. But if you do have at least, even if you have like only one employee and the employee is part-time, it's definitely going to help your application. If you already have employees, but it's not required. Now let's discuss, the kind of like the source and trail of funds. So as I just mentioned, if you want to do a USCIS filing, if you want to do a change of status filing, you will need like a very detailed documentation about the source and trail of funds. So that's kind of like one thing to keep in mind. Loans. So loans are generally fine for an E-2 visa. Like you can get a loan from a financial institution, you can get a loan from, like a family or friend, like those are all fine. For the E-2, just one type of loan that is not allowed, as Kelly already mentioned, is kind of a loan that is secured by the assets of the E-2 company. So that is not allowed. But if the loan is secured by, like let's say by your house, your house in your home country, or anything else other than the E-2 company, like that's fine. And also gifts. So gifts are fine as well. So, a family member or a friend or, anyone can gift you money for the investment. But we would still, then we would have to explain like where did that person who is gifting you the money, like where did they get the money from? And we would have to kind of submit some documents supporting like what's the source of that money. So like let's say that like your relative like sold a house and then they gifted you some portion of the money they got from the sale of the house. In that case we would submit a gift letter from the person to you, and then the purchase sale of the document showing that they sold the house, to just kind of like be able to explain like what's the source of the money. So then another kind of thing or question we sometimes get is, can two investors get two E-2 visas like for the same company? So the answer is yes, but they would have to own the business 50-50. Because one of the E-2 visa requirements is that the E-2 investor owns at least 50%. So I would say yes, this is possible. We would want to, we would have to explain like what will be the role of each investor in the company. So, because we would kind of like want to show that each investor kind of like meets the develop and direct requirement. So, like what we see often is that, like one person is like the CEO, the other one is like chief operating officers or, like something like that. But we would have to show that each investor has kind of like the high level, like executive or managerial position in the E-2 company. And one thing I just wanted to mention is that, if the E-2 investors are related, so like, let's say it's like, like a father and son or like two brothers, like those types of cases are, like maybe kind of like scrutinized, a little bit more. But we have had cases, like that were still approved, but they just maybe, scrutinized a little bit more by the government. So now what happens if there is a substantive change to the E-2 business after the E-2 visa was approved? So, like let's say that at the time we filed the E-2 application, you owned 100% of the company, but like later you sold 40% to someone else. So, that's fine. I would say the changes in ownership are fine as long as you always keep at least 50% in the company. And usually, like we wouldn't have to kind of like go back to the consulate and kind of like let them know like, oh, there was this change, as long as you always maintain the 50% ownership. And then we would just kind of like want to mention it at the renewal stage and just kind of like let the consulate know. what's the current ownership structure. But one thing to keep in mind is that it's very important is that your ownership always has to stay at least 50%, because if it drops, then you no longer meet the E-2 visa requirements. And then another type of change, we see is change in the type of business. This is gonna depend, like what is the change. So like, let's say that you own a restaurant, and now you want to start providing, I don't know, like consulting services in the restaurant and food industry, or you also want to open like a catering business, under the same LLC. So, that would generally be fine, because, the kind of like the new services you plan to provide are still within kind of like the same industry. But let's say that you own a restaurant, and now you want to start like a real estate brokerage company. So those two types of, services are kind of like completely unrelated. So for that new service, like the real estate brokerage company, we would need to go back to the consulate and kind of like submit a new application for the new type of service you want to provide, and get the approval before you start that type of service. Just because the E-2 visa is a company specific, and it's like specific for the type of business that was originally kind of like outlined in the original application. So if the new service you want to start providing is completely unrelated, we would have to go back either to the consulate or to USCIS and get the approval before you start providing kind of like the new service offering. And last thing I wanted to mention are family business purchases. So there is nothing in the regulations that says that you cannot purchase a business from a relative. But I will say, those, if you are purchasing a business from your relative, those types of cases will be kind of like scrutinized by the government more, because they just want to make sure that you paid the fair market value for the business. So, for these types of cases, we would want to submit like an evaluation of the business showing, like how much is the business worth. And then we would want to show that in the purchase sale agreement, you paid the fair market value, just so, to show that, this is a legitimate transaction. You paid the fair market value for the type of business, even though it was purchased from a family relative. Perfect. So now let's see if we have any questions. Perfect. So someone is asking how many for how many years does the business plan have to be, like how many employees at the end of the business, or do you recommend? Yeah, so we generally recommend that the business plan is for a period of 5 years. And then by the end of year 5, the company should have at least 3 full-time employees. So that's kind of our general recommendation. Another question that came up is, so someone is planning to apply for an E-2 visa from the UK. It's going to be a business consultancy specializing in energy. In terms of investment, do I need to show amount being spent first before I apply for an E-2 visa? And kind of like, I think like what should be the minimum investment amount spent?
Yeah, so I can answer this one. I mean, I think that, like in terms of, specifics on amounts, that's kind of not something that we can kind of speak to in this forum, but certainly something that, could be discussed in a consultation if you'd like to set some, one up. I think if you're investing around 100,000, generally we're going to recommend spending around 50,000. And yes, it does need to be spent before you apply. When you're doing a startup, there's really not the option to put money in an escrow account. Although, some people sometimes will try to do this. We think it's not as, we don't recommend this. We never do this. Generally, our recommendation is the money needs to be spent to be considered at risk and irrevocably committed. Escrow is really most appropriate when you're purchasing a business, not doing a startup. Someone's asking, can an Indian citizen apply for an E-2 visa? So unfortunately, India is not a treaty country. So Indian nationals are not eligible for an E-2 visa using their Indian passport. If you have a passport for a different country like Canada that is an E-2 country, then yes, you could apply. And Michaela, I'll let you take this next one.
Yeah, so the next one is someone is planning to open coffee and donut shop, not very large one. So what should be the minimum investment? Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of hard to say. So like, you know, like the general recommendation is that you spend kind of like everything you need to spend to establish, you know, the business. So for something like coffee and donut shop, you know, you should get obviously like a space. You know, you can prepay like 3, 6, 12 months for the coffee space. Then you know, you will need to buy like the coffee machines, like the equipment. You know, if it's not furnished, you know, you will need to furnish it. You know, you will need to buy some initial inventory, you know, to kind of like make the coffee and the donuts. You know, so those would be kind of like the initial expenditures like you absolutely like have to make. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of, you know, it will also depend like where, you know, with regards to amount, it's going to depend like which state are you establishing it, like what's the price of the things in that state. But yeah, the general recommendation what you will have to show is that you have spent everything that was needed to kind of open the store for customers.
Perfect. So someone's asking about lowest investment amount for a consulting business. And again, you know, when we're saying numbers, you know, these numbers, you know, it's always going to matter like what is in the rest of the application, right? It's not just the number, it's also if you have a very low number. So for example, I've seen a consulting business be successful with $35,000 investment, and that full $35,000 was spent. It's a very, very low investment amount. That was with USCIS, which is friendlier to low investment amounts than many consulates. But in that case, the person had very, very strong other aspects of the case. They had strong contracts. They had a really good background, you know, demonstrable, like, you know, examples of success in the past. So those are things that are always very important. If you're going to have a really low investment amount, the other parts of the application also need to be strong. So someone's asking about how much working capital can you leave in your bank account. So you're not really required to have any particular amount of working capital, but I think, you know, so that's really kind of up to the business owner. I think it can be helpful, particularly if the financials show you're going to have a lot of ongoing expenses initially. You want to have, you know, enough money in the bank account to help cover those. But we've certainly applied where there's very low amounts of working capital, and that's, you know, that's generally fine. Because we're kind of running low on time, I'll answer a couple of these and then turn it back to you, Michaela. So can we apply for an E-2 while on a TN and present in the US? Yes, you can. Someone already has an E-2 and purchased a new business with, let's say, 25% partnership. So you're only permitted to, so I'm not sure if you purchased the new business through an asset sale or a share sale. But, you know, as Michaela kind of discussed during the presentation, depending on whether or not the new business is in line with your prior E-2 business, you know, you may want to go back to the consulate sooner than renewal time. Additionally, if this is a completely different business, you know, business entity, you're only permitted to work for your E-2 business entity. So, you know, that's something, this situation I'd say is a bit more complicated, something best discussed during a consultation. If you start a business in the US, but your visa is denied, what is the status of your business? That really depends on you. You can hire people to run it. You can dissolve the corporation. That would be up to you. If a spouse gets a job in the US, can they apply for an immigrant visa? They may be able to, depending on whether or not there's an immigrant visa available in their category. We have had situations where an E-2 or an E-2 visa holder's spouse is being sponsored for a green card through the PERM process by their US employer. So that is possible. So Michaela, I think there's 3 last ones. We'll finish these up and close.
So the next one is, can I use my business plan to get a loan for the business startup? So yeah, I mean, you know, like you can present or show the business plan to kind of like, you know, anyone you want, like it's the, you know, document you drafted. So I don't see a problem with that. this loan could be a confirmation of my business plan from the third party. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question.
I
But
mean, I think the most important thing is just the loan cannot be secured by assets of the E2 business, right? So like if you're, you know, when you say using your business plan to get a loan, I also don't understand kind of what that means. But if they are, you know, giving you the loan and the security for the loan is any of the assets of the E2 business or the E2 business itself, that would not work. You would need to have the loan either be unsecured or based on, you know, based on personal property or personal assets.
Yeah, and the last question is, sometimes officers say that the amount of revenue and taxes is not substantial. And this is subjective thinking from the officer, yes, I would say like the E2 visa adjudications like are very, sometimes like subjective to, what the officers like think about the business. I would say like generally if the revenue is very low, like if the revenue is like 60,000 per year in the past, like 1 to 3 years, they may just kind of conclude that it's not substantial because they may think that, the business will not be able to employ you as workers. So yeah, sometimes they make that conclusion. Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Kelly, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.